In studying the Book of Lamentations, it is helpful for us to see how the Book of Lamentations, as it relates to the process of working through trauma and grief, of looking at the literary characteristics within the book. Just as a little bit of background, traditionally, the Book of Lamentations has been attributed to Jeremiah after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And that tradition goes back at least as far as the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, around the 2nd century BC, because at the very beginning of the Septuagint, it is appended the statement in its verse 1, a statement which is not in the Hebrew Bible. And it came to pass after Israel was taken captive and Jerusalem made desolate, that Jeremiah sat weeping and lamented with this lamentation over Jerusalem and said, and then it continues with what we have in our text of Lamentations as well. So the early Jewish and Christian tradition did attribute the book to the prophet Jeremiah and to that specific historical context. Now, the Book of Lamentations is actually composed of 5 separate poems, which is divided into 5 chapters for us. And I've simply given you kind of this chart, which you can use kind of as a reference for your reading through the Book of Lamentations. And I'll be talking about elements of this as we proceed here. But the title, the Book of Lamentations, comes from the kind of poetry which those 5 poems consist of in the Book of Lamentations. Because the term lamentation actually refers to a poem that mourns the death. In other words, it is a mourning song, or a song which would be sung at a funeral dirge. So when talking about the Book of Lamentations, it is helpful for us to kind of distinguish between kind of the 2 literary genres or literary types which are found within the book. But again, the term lamentation refers to a poem, which is a mourning song or a song sung like at a funeral. But the term lamentations as a genre is a type of poem which is not addressed to anyone in particular, but rather it mourns a death, whether the death of a city or whether the death of as in Lamentations, or it can also mourn the death of an individual. But as a mourning song, the audience is very general in nature. In fact, a lamentation is not specifically being addressed to anyone as the person voices the sorrow over that death. This is in contrast to the literary genre of a lament. That a lament is a prayer specifically addressed to God in the midst of a distressing or traumatic situation that almost always includes a sense of assurance that God will hear and intervene into that situation. And so to kind of contrast the 2 a little bit more, we understand then that the genre of lamentation is really death-oriented. And it's death-oriented in the sense that it is voiced in response to the death that has occurred. And thus, its content primarily compares the past glory with the present loss due to the death. This in contrast to lament as a prayer addressed to God in the midst of a distressing situation. A lament is very life-oriented, as the lament speaks of the present distress which the person is in and talking to God about, but it also looks forward to the future deliverance and restoration which God will bring about. And so we find that the Book of Lamentations is actually a mixture of these two literary genres or literary types. It is in the form of a city lamentation, as it is a lamentation over the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the death of the nation of Judah. So it is a funeral or a mourning song. But as part of the poetry of the Book of Lamentations, it also contains laments. In other words, prayers addressed to God, which are spoken by, at times, a single speaker who uses the first person singular, I or me, and these are referred to as individual laments, but also laments that are spoken by the collective community, and thus using we or us, and these are referred to as communal laments. And examples of both individual laments and communal laments are also found in the genre of lament psalms, which we have in the book of Psalms itself. Simply by way of showing kind of the broad generic classification within the book of Lamentations, of lamentation and lament, I'm giving you, for your information, this chart, which you can use for further reference as we continue reading through Lamentations. But as you can see, chapters 1, 2, and 4 have significant sections which are lamentation or mourning songs. But in each of those chapters, they are also combined with lament or prayers addressed to God. Whereas chapters 3 and 5 are solely laments, both individual and communal laments, again, prayers addressed specifically to God. Now, one of the things that the genre reflects about this whole process of working through grief is that within the context of mourning and lament, it does involve the whole community. So the Book of Lamentations expresses the lamentations and laments of the collective community, but it also gives individual laments which are voiced within the context of the community hearing these individual laments. And I think instructive for us in this process of working through grief, especially for corporate traumas, corporate events, for example, the current coronavirus pandemic, that these corporate events are something in which the whole community needs to be involved in the process of working through the trauma. And that even when we are going through individual traumas, the process of working through that trauma, even as an individual, we really do need to voice them in the context of the community. We need the support of the community in helping us as we work through the grief and the trauma. So the Book of Lamentations is a mixture of genre types. It is a mixture of the city lamentation along with lament, prayers directed toward God. But it's not only that mixture of genre. We need to realize that excuse me, we need to realize that the Book of Lamentations is also a poetic expression of trauma. It's a collection of 5 poems. It is not a prose narrative account of the trauma. And we realize that there is a clear difference between poetry and prose, that poetry is much more effective as it captures and communicates the emotions of the events. And with respect to us processing and working through grief, we need to realize that this written form of poetic expression of mourning and lamenting It really is designed to be used subsequently in various situations as an aid to help us in our grieving process. And thus, the book of Lamentations and even the lament psalms from the book of Psalms are designed to be used as model prayers and expressions of grief, in which we appropriate the words of these poems. We appropriate the words and the emotions and we personalize them by turning them into our own personal expressions of grief and lament. And these poems are especially helpful as model expressions for us when in the midst of our trauma, we do not on our own have the words to speak. And so we can use and appropriate these words to make them our own words. And as we think about the book of Lamentations being a poetic expression of the trauma, we realize that it contains thus a mixture of poetic elements which seem to be significant as part of that poetry. And the first poetic element is that of being an acrostic or also a pseudo-alphabetic poem. Now, what is an acrostic? An acrostic poem is a poem in which each successive poetic line or groups of lines begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And we have several other examples of acrostic poems in Old Testament poetry besides the chapters in Lamentations. We have a number of acrostic poems in the book of Psalms, for example, and also the poem related to the wife at the end of the book of Proverbs in chapter 31. All of these are acrostic poems. Now, the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. And so we find that the chapters in the book of Lamentations are either 22 verses long or multiples of 22 verses, which then reflects the moving through the Hebrew alphabet letter by letter. We do need to note that chapter 5 of Lamentations is not an acrostic, but I think appropriately referred to as a pseudo-alphabetic poem, in that it does consist of 22 lines or 22 verses, and it thus mimics the preceding 4 acrostic poems that are found in chapters 1 through 4. Now, more significant than just identifying the literary form that they are acrostic poems, more significant is to understand what is the impact of reading an acrostic poem. And I would suggest that with respect to the book of Lamentations, there are several effects of that acrostic form. One is that in the midst of a completely destructive and chaotic situation of trauma, the acrostic format does superimpose a kind of structure or order. In other words, it produces a framework within which to describe the chaos. Another thing which the acrostic form seems to do is that in the midst of the tragedy, in which there does seem to be no sense of progress in the event itself, the acrostic structure does give then a sense of progress as one systematically moves through the alphabet. So you move from A to B to C, etc., on through till you get to the end of the alphabet. There is a sense of progressing through the expression of grief. But also another aspect is, in the midst of grief, to which there is no seemingly end in sight, each of the single acrostic poems in the book of Lamentations does give a sense of completeness, of having worked through it from beginning to end. Or in English, as we say, you move through something from A to Z, A to Z, from beginning to end. And each of the separate acrostic poems, thus, as it moves through the alphabet, has this sense of having moved through the sense of grief and tragedy. And so even though it does have that sense of completeness, a sense of form, a sense of orderliness, the acrostic poem also communicates through its form clearly a sense of disjointedness. As each separate alphabet verse becomes a unit unto itself. Even though you move from A to Z, the A verse is kind of a separate statement, followed by the B verse, which is a completely separate and can be a disassociated statement, followed by a C verse, which similarly might be disassociated from A or B. In other words, it does convey the sense that you're simply stringing together independent thoughts rather than this kind of coherent sequential development of the thought. In other words, reading an acrostic of A, B, C, it is more like you're reading tweets rather than having an extended running poetic description. Or it's like viewing random snapshots rather than viewing a sequential video. And that sense of disjointedness does really fit the situations of the trauma and the emotions of the trauma. The poetry seems disjointed, just like the traumatic event is very disjointed. And also it does communicate this sense of lack of cohesiveness, that you feel like you're moving through the trauma, but you're not doing so in a systematic way. You're not systematically expressing the emotions as you move through it. And so the overall effect of this repeated acrostic form in the Book of Lamentations with respect to the process of working through grief does really communicate this sense that working through grief is not simply a linear one-time event. You don't just begin and work through the emotions and then it's all done. You've worked through, you've finished, you've completed it. No, rather one goes through a repeated cycle of working through it over and over again. So in chapter 1, you go from A to Z, but then you start all over in chapter 2 and go from A to Z once again. Then you start all over in chapter 3 and work through it from beginning to end once again. So one of the significant aspects of the Book of Lamentations and its poetic expression of the trauma is that it uses the acrostic poetic form. Another significant aspect, literary aspect, is that of the rhythm, or some would call it a metrical pattern that is found within the poetry. That there is a definite rhythm, that each poetic line is composed of a longer statement followed by a shorter statement. And thus the longer and shorter statements form one poetic line. And so it creates this rhythmic or metrical pattern, often referred to as a 3+2. The longer line 3, the shorter second part of the line 2. And need to recognize that almost all of the lines of poetry in chapters 1 through 4 follow that 3+2 pattern. But we get to chapter 5, and the pattern is dropped, and the lines become then of equal length. Now, with respect to this pattern of 3+2 for a poetic line, it is often associated with lamentation, the genre of lamentation or mourning song. But we need to recognize it's not exclusive to that. In other words, other poems which are not lamentations also have this rhythmic pattern. Nor does a lamentation have to use that rhythmic pattern. We have other examples of in the Old Testament of lamentations in which this rhythmic pattern is not followed. But we do need to recognize that it is the prominent pattern in chapters 1 through 4 of the Book of Lamentations. More significant, again, than just identifying the pattern is what is the purpose or the function of this poetic form, especially in the context of a morning song or the lamentation here. It does give a sense of asymmetry or a lack of balance with a longer and then a shorter line, a sense of incompleteness. Now, we're not exactly sure of the ancient significance of that rhythmic pattern as to why they used it, but some have suggested that it is imitative of someone or something is missing in that final line, and thus someone or something is missing due to the death. Very similar to what we would do in a military funeral where, as the planes are flying over for the funeral, one of the planes is missing in the V formation, and it's very noticeable. Or, as well as in funeral processions in which oftentimes, for like a leader, you have a riderless horse. Something is missing, just like something's missing in that second part of the poetic line. Or some have suggested this 3/2 rhythmic pattern is really imitative of the cutting off of life before its natural completion. You're expecting the line to finish, but it doesn't. Just like a life is unexpectedly cut off. Or some have suggested it's imitative of limping, which might have been possibly tied to a morning dance or ritual during which the recitation of the lamentation occurred. Or some have suggested the 3/2 pattern is imitative of the voice breaking off due to the extreme emotion or sobbing. And again, we're not quite sure, but it does seem that this long plus short rhythmic pattern does fit the context of lamentation and mourning. And we find that what is interesting is that we find that not only do the poetic lines have this 3+2 or long plus short rhythmic pattern, but the whole book of Lamentations seems to be structured on that same mourning pattern. In other words, you have the 3 long, chapters 1, 2, and 3, and you can see the similarity. They each have 3-line stanzas, each contains 66 poetic lines. But suddenly you get to the last 2 chapters, and chapter 4 only has 2-line stanzas and thus 44 poetic lines, and chapter 5 is even shorter with 1-line stanza and ends up with 22 poetic lines. In other words, again, the whole book seems to reflect this rhythmic pattern, which at least here is tied with lamentation and mourning. So within the poetic features of the Book of Lamentations, you have the acrostic form, you have the rhythmic pattern, but also another poetic element to note is the multiple voices in the Book of Lamentations. Now within Lamentations, it seems like there are 4 main speaking voices, 4 main different speakers. But then there are other speakers who are also quoted within these. For example, the passers-by are quoted. At one point, the children, what the children say is quoted by these other speakers. But 4 main different speakers. One is, we will refer to him as the sympathetic reporter. He's unidentified within the poetry, but clearly somebody who is reporting what they are seeing with respect to the destruction of Jerusalem, and doing so in a very sympathetic manner. Dominant speaker in chapters 1, 2, and 4. But then also we have Jerusalem itself, which is personified and spoken of as daughter Zion. And Jerusalem, the collective community of Jerusalem, speaking in the first person singular, using I or me. Chapters 1 and 2. And then in chapter 3, we are introduced to, he introduces himself as the man who has seen affliction, clearly a survivor who has lived through the destruction of Jerusalem. And then in chapters 3, 4, and 5, we also have the collective people of Jerusalem, but now speaking in the first person plural, we and us. And they would be then the same individuals or the same character as the personified Jerusalem of daughter Zion. And again, here is just a chart that kind of illustrates in chapters 1 through 5 this breakdown of the speaking voices. Again, this is simply for your information as we read through and continue to study the book of Lamentations. But again, what is the purpose of these different speaking voices in Lamentation? I think because the suffering and the trauma is viewed through multiple lenses and through several points of view, we as readers then hear the description of the trauma from a whole variety of perspectives. And that gives to us a fuller emotional feel and a fuller descriptive picture of the traumatic event. And when you then put together this mixture of genres plus these different poetic styles of the acrostic, the rhythmic pattern, and the speaking voices, we recognize that the poetry then very much fits the emotions of the trauma. That the shifting from one genre to another, the shifting from one speaking voice to another, without any smooth or coherent transitions from one to the other, it does really result in a lack of a cohesive thematic organizational structure or movement in each of the individual poems or in the combined collection of poems. And that shifting from one genre to another, the shifting of voices, actually does kind of reflect the chaotic and disruptive circumstances and emotions of the trauma itself, as well as really reflects kind of the difficulty in trying to communicate that traumatic event. And so that purpose, I think, is instructive for us as well, that in the midst of our traumas, we are trying to process and work through our grief and trauma. That as we appropriate these poems of Lamentations as our prayers and expressions of our trauma, it really does indicate to us that the multitude of emotions are not nicely integrated or grouped together. Our emotions are jumbled together, with one leading into or eliciting another, and then going back to a previous emotion. And such also indicates that to us, that there is no nice, sequential, clear-cut movement and progression in working through our trauma. And so the mixture of Lamentations, it is a mixture of genre, a mixture of a city lamentation, mourning song, along with lament, prayers addressed to God. And as a poetic expression of that trauma, it is a mixture of poetic elements, the acrostic, the rhythmic pattern, and multiple voices. And again, I would suggest to you that the literary characteristics and forms of the Book of Lamentations suggest that it was purposely chosen to reflect and communicate the traumatic experience, as well as then to give us an appropriate form and way for us to work through our trauma by using and appropriating those words of lamentations and prayers of lament. And as we continue to work through the book of Lamentations, as you specifically are reading the book of Lamentation, thinking in the terms of the literary forms, the way in which the trauma is being expressed in the book, simply a question to always keep in mind as you are reading through, a question for you to respond to and answer. That when you are personally going through trauma, to what within the book of Lamentations do you really relate? Maybe it is the poetic way in which things are described. Maybe you really relate to the poetic expressions of emotions that are there. But again, in other words, as you read through the book of Lamentations, with what parts of its poetry do you really connect and find helpful for yourself as you experience times of trauma and grief and suffering?